got to be comfortable with the grey, and we've got to accept that there's not always going to be answers that are that clear to us.
Dave, I'm going to come to you, and this is an area that's actually also come up in the chat function. So we've talked a lot, we tend to lean into team sports and team environments when we think about trials and selections. With your hat on, you work into a lot of sports that aren't team sports, individual sports. How, is there anything different in an individual sport where, time and other factors come in a lot? I'm thinking swimming and athletics. Any learnings from working with individual sports?
Yeah, look, I'll dive into the team side first, and then I'll elaborate on that, Alex. My background's in football prior to HPSNZ, and I've been lucky to work in the professional academy scene in the UK, particularly where individualized programs are the bread and butter of those clubs. And there are lots of things within that system which are far from perfect, but there's lots of excellent examples of how team sports can be individualized. So whether that's being really clear with young athletes around having an individual plan, and for young kids, that could be as simple as, hey, what are you really good at and what would you like to work on? And then from there, we've got a conversation that we can have every week at training. So within team sports, I think it is important that we do look at that as we are developing individuals or giving an experience to every individual in the group as best we can. When it comes to those CGS sports or centimeters, grams, and seconds, we're obviously talking about sports where performance can be measured, and it doesn't matter whether you're a 12-year-old swimming in a pool or an 18-year-old running on a track. There's still times involved, right? So a lot of the challenges with development are that we've got to live in the grey, and we've got to be comfortable with that. And we also live in a really data-driven world, whereas adults, we always want to measure everything and make things a black and white science, when we've got to accept that when working with young people and working in sports systems, there is a lot of grey, and we need to have that longer window. I'm lucky to do a lot of work with Swimming New Zealand, and the guys there, as I mentioned earlier, are making some changes around how they look at age groups, how they look at the calendar year. They're focusing really at Swimming New Zealand on trying to become the most skillful swimming nation in the world, and the conduit for Swimming New Zealand to do that is through coach education. So they're really trying to upskill the coaches who are out there around how they can, develop more skillful athletes. And how they can combat things like relative age effect. And the HPAD leader in that sport is really looking into things like peak height velocity, and growth and maturation, to understand that when they're looking at athletes in that sport, obviously, if you've got a 14-year-old swimmer who's very physically mature, then they're probably going to be stronger and faster at that point on the journey. But teaching and supporting coaches to understand that maybe you've got a really skillful swimmer in this group who has not yet even hit that maturation point, who needs the right time and support wrapped around them, can be a really important thing. So I can't sit here and say there's one answer for that, but I think when it comes to those sports where there is a measurement in play, you need to be able to look at things like character, like coachability that we've talked about, which again it can be ambiguous because it's open to, debate as to what coachability even means. But character traits, let's say, or behaviors when you're starting to get to the performance end. So what are some of those behaviors that we could look for from there? And then the final piece of that is that a lot of these sports, again, that are measuring or have times involved or centimeters and grams, they'll also, when selecting athletes, go through a process of application. So swimming is one, when it goes further up the pathway, and rowing for certain support for athletes at different stages of the pathway. The athletes might actually have to apply and present themselves to a panel to say, look, we know what you can go do out in the boat or in the pool, but we want to know a little bit more about you. And what are some of the things that might come through in those discussions? And obviously coaches and the sport itself will have a huge influence on that selection. But it's important to look at more than just the time. So black and white's really easy. And from an administrative perspective, it's great because it makes things easy for us to manage, whether we're organizing 100 kids at a hockey trial or whether we're selecting athletes for funding. But we've got to be comfortable with the grey, and we've got to accept that there's not always going to be answers that are that clear to us.